I judged a refugee at the border. Then he saved my brother's life. The dust devils danced on the cracked earth, mirroring the unease swirling in my gut. I gripped the steering wheel, knuckles white, the sun beating down like a judgment. We'd been driving for hours, the flat, endless Texas landscape blurring into a monotonous haze. My brother Mark was in the passenger seat, his usual boisterous energy muted by a fever that had spiked alarmingly overnight. He'd insisted we drive south to the border, chasing a whispered rumor of a doctor, a chance, anything to break through the medical impasse back home. I, on the other hand, felt a growing resentment. This whole trip felt like a fool's errand, a desperate gamble fueled by Mark's stubborn optimism and my own gnawing fear. We were hours from any real town, the air thick with the smell of creosote, and something else, something sharp and metallic that I couldn't quite place. Mark coughed, a dry hacking sound that tore at my nerves. "Almost there," he rasped, his voice barely a whisper. I nodded, but my eyes scanned the roadside with a different kind of anxiety. This was border country, a place I'd only seen on the news, a place I associated with desperation, with people I deemed other. My mind, conditioned by years of curated news feeds and casual assumptions, had already painted a picture of the kinds of faces I might see here. Faces etched with need, with a desperation that felt alien, almost threatening. I'd always prided myself on being a good person, on fairness, but a subtle prejudice had always lingered, a quiet judgment I'd never truly examined. It was a blind spot, a comfortable certainty that allowed me to categorize and dismiss, to create an us and a them. The rumor had led us to a small makeshift clinic, little more than a cluster of tents and a few portable buildings baking under the relentless sun. The air here was alive with a cacophony of sounds, the low murmur of unfamiliar languages, the cries of children, the distant hum of vehicles, and the ever-present buzz of insects. It was overwhelming, a sensory overload that amplified my unease. As we pulled up, a man emerged from one of the tents. He was tall, his face weathered and lined, his eyes carrying a weariness that seemed to go beyond physical exhaustion. He wore simple, worn clothing, and his hands, I noticed, were rough and calloused. My immediate unbidden thought, the one I pushed down but couldn't entirely silence, was one of suspicion. He looked like them, the people I'd been unconsciously bracing myself to encounter. He looked like the faces from the news, the ones I'd silently judged, the ones I'd assumed were a drain, a problem, a burden. I stepped out of the car, the heat hitting me like a physical blow. Mark, leaning heavily on the doorframe, coughed again, a more violent spasm this time. The man approached, his expression unreadable. He didn't speak immediately, his gaze sweeping over us, taking in Mark's pale face and my own strained demeanor. I felt a prickle of defensiveness, a surge of irrational anger. I was here for my brother, for a medical emergency, and this man, this stranger, felt like an obstacle, a symbol of everything I'd unconsciously feared about this place. My internal monologue, usually a steady stream of practical concerns, was now a torrent of judgment. He looked tired, yes, but was it the fatigue of hard work or the resignation of someone who had given up? His clothes were worn, but were they a sign of poverty or a deliberate lack of care? These were the questions my mind, so quick to categorize, was already formulating, building walls of assumption around him before he'd even uttered a word. I saw his hands rough and strong, and my mind, without conscious effort, conjured images of labor, of hardship, of a life so different from my own that it felt almost incomprehensible, and therefore suspect. He finally spoke, his voice low and calm, a stark contrast to the frantic energy I felt coursing through me. His English was accented but clear. "He is not well," he stated. Not a question, but an observation. I wanted to snap, to demand help, to assert my presence, but Mark let out a pained groan, and that sound cut through my defensiveness, a sharp reminder of why we were here. The man's eyes, which I had initially perceived as distant or perhaps even indifferent, now held a flicker of something else, concern. It was subtle, almost imperceptible, but it was there. He moved towards Mark with a quiet confidence, his presence surprisingly reassuring. He didn't ask for papers. He didn't ask for payment up front. He simply looked at my brother with an intensity that felt both professional and deeply human. He gestured towards the tent. "Come, we will see." My initial judgment, so swift and sure, began to feel hollow, a foolish echo in the vastness of the desert air. The man, whose name I would soon learn was Elias, didn't fit the narrative I had so readily constructed. He was simply a person, offering help in a place where help was desperately needed. The inside of the tent was surprisingly cool, a welcome respite from the oppressive heat. It was sparsely furnished, a cot, a small table, and a collection of medical supplies neatly arranged. The air was cleaner here, carrying the faint scent of antiseptic. Elias moved with an economy of motion, his hands gentle as he examined Mark. He asked quiet questions, his gaze steady, his focus unwavering. I watched him, my earlier suspicions slowly dissolving, replaced by a grudging admiration. He wasn't just a refugee. He was a healer, a man who had found a way to serve, to contribute, to alleviate suffering, even in this harsh and transient place. He spoke of common ailments, of remedies that seemed ancient yet effective, of a life lived in service to others. He explained in his calm, measured way that he'd been a doctor in his home country, forced to flee but unable to abandon the calling to heal. He spoke not of his own hardships, but of the needs he saw around him, of the desperate lack of medical care for those who had nowhere else to turn. He was a testament to resilience, not just in surviving his own ordeal, but in choosing compassion in the face of adversity. My own internal narrative, so focused on my own inconvenience and fear, felt small and selfish in comparison. He prepared a simple saline drip for Mark, his movements precise and practiced. As the fluid slowly entered Mark's veins, a subtle change began to occur. The feverish flush on Mark's cheeks softened, his breathing deepened, and a hint of his usual color returned. Elias sat beside him, his presence a quiet anchor. He didn't offer platitudes or false promises, just a steady hand on Mark's shoulder, a silent reassurance. I watched this exchange, the unspoken connection between the two men, and a profound shift began within me. I had come here with my prejudices firmly in place, ready to see the worst, to confirm my own biases. Instead, I was witnessing an act of pure, unadulterated kindness, offered by someone I had so readily judged. The contrast was stark, and it hit me with the force of a physical blow. Elias, the man I had dismissed as just another face in a crowd of others, was demonstrating a level of empathy and dedication that put my own self-absorption to shame. The night wore on, and Mark's fever finally broke. He slept soundly, his breathing now even and peaceful. Elias stayed, a silent guardian, his own weariness evident but unacknowledged. I sat in the dim light, the silence of the tent punctuated only by Mark's soft snores and the distant desert sounds. My mind replayed the day's events, each memory a sharp jab of self-recrimination. I thought of the assumptions I had made, the judgments I had passed, the invisible walls I had erected. Elias, the refugee, the man I had seen as a potential problem, had become my brother's savior. He had offered his skills, his time, his compassion, without expectation of reward, driven by a fundamental human instinct to help. My own internal dialogue, once filled with suspicion and resentment, was now a hollow echo, replaced by the quiet realization of my own profound error. I had seen a person in need, and instead of offering empathy, I had offered judgment. The sun rose, painting the desert sky in hues of orange and pink, a soft light filtering into the tent. Mark stirred, his eyes blinking open, a weak smile touching his lips. He looked at Elias, then at me, a question in his gaze. Elias simply nodded, a gentle acknowledgement of Mark's recovery. He gathered his supplies, his movements unhurried. He refused any payment, his only request being that we pass on the kindness if we ever had the chance. As we prepared to leave, I turned to Elias. The words I wanted to say, the apology I owed him, felt inadequate, clumsy. I simply met his gaze, and in that silent exchange, I hoped he understood the depth of my regret, the seismic shift that had occurred within me. He offered a small, knowing smile, a gesture of grace that transcended language. We drove away, the dust devils still dancing, but the unease in my gut had been replaced by a quiet understanding. The desert, once a symbol of my fear and judgment, now felt like a vast open space, a place where assumptions could be shed and compassion could take root. The journey back was different. The landscape was the same, but my perspective had been irrevocably altered. Mark, still weak but recovering, slept soundly in the passenger seat, his labored breathing replaced by a gentle rhythm. I drove with a newfound awareness, my senses attuned to the world around me, in a way they hadn't been before. The harshness of the borderlands no longer felt menacing, but simply real. It was a place of struggle, yes, but also a place of profound human connection, of resilience forged in the fires of necessity. I thought of Elias, his quiet strength, his unwavering dedication to healing. He was a man who had lost everything, yet had found a way to give back, to serve, to be a beacon of hope in a place often defined by despair. My own life, with its comforts and certainties, suddenly felt less significant, less important than the simple, powerful act of alleviating another's suffering. My judgment of Elias had been a reflection of my own limitations, a failure to see beyond the superficial, to recognize the shared humanity that binds us all. I had seen a label, refugee, and allowed it to obscure the person, the healer, the man who had ultimately saved my brother. That realization was a bitter pill to swallow, a harsh but necessary lesson. It wasn't about the systems or the politics. It was about me, about my own internal landscape, about the walls I had built and the empathy I had failed to extend. The encounter had stripped away my comfortable illusions, forcing me to confront the quiet prejudice that had resided within me. A prejudice I had never acknowledged, never truly examined. It was a humbling, deeply personal reckoning. The sun dipped below the horizon, casting long shadows across the road. Mark was awake now, his voice stronger as he spoke of his recovery. I listened, my heart full, not just with relief for his health, but with a profound gratitude for the man who had made it possible. Elias's act of kindness had not just healed my brother, it had begun to heal a part of me that I hadn't even known was broken. The road ahead stretched out, dark and unknown, but for the first time in a long time, I felt a sense of genuine hope, a quiet certainty that even in the most unexpected encounters, the possibility for redemption, for a more compassionate way of being, always exists. Kindness, a borrowed light, found its way through the cracks of judgment. The desert air, now cool and carrying the scent of distant rain, felt different as we drove. It wasn't just the absence of Mark's feverish cough. It was the shift within me, a subtle recalibration of my internal compass. The stark beauty of the landscape, which had previously only amplified my anxiety, now seemed to hold a quiet wisdom. I noticed the resilience of the scrub brush, clinging to life in the arid soil, its roots reaching deep for sustenance. This tenacious spirit mirrored Elias's own quiet strength, a determination to flourish despite an environment that seemed intent on withholding its bounty. It wasn't about grand gestures or dramatic pronouncements. It was about the persistent, almost invisible effort to survive and, more importantly, to contribute. My own tendency to seek immediate validation, to expect gratitude for small kindnesses, felt shallow in comparison to his unwavering, unassuming service. Furthermore, the concept of need itself began to reframe itself in my mind. I had always viewed need as a deficit, a lack that demanded immediate rectification, often accompanied by a sense of burden. Elias, however, seemed to perceive need as an opportunity, a universal human condition that called for connection rather than judgment. He didn't see the families at the clinic as problems to be solved, but as individuals deserving of care, their circumstances a backdrop to their fundamental human dignity. This perspective offered a profound counterpoint to my own ingrained tendency to categorize and compartmentalize, to create hierarchies of worth based on perceived productivity or societal contribution. Now consider how this applies when you face someone whose life circumstances are vastly different from your own. Instead of focusing on the perceived gap, try to recognize the shared human desire for respect and care. The silence in the car, once a breeding ground for my anxious thoughts, now became a space for quiet contemplation. I recalled the subtle ways I had dismissed Elias's humanity before I even knew his name. His worn clothes, his accent, the very fact of his presence in a place I associated with problems, all had served as triggers for my preconceived notions. It was a stark reminder that our initial impressions are often filtered through a lens of ingrained biases, a lens that can distort reality and obscure the truth of another's character. The ease with which I had assigned him a narrative, a role based on stereotypes, was deeply unsettling. It wasn't a malicious intent, but a passive acceptance of societal conditioning, a failure to actively challenge my own assumptions. Conversely, the memory of Elias's hands, rough and calloused, no longer evoked suspicion. Instead, I saw them as instruments of healing, hands that had likely toiled in fields, built homes, and most importantly, brought comfort to the sick and injured. They were hands that spoke of a life lived, of challenges faced and overcome, of a capacity for resilience that I had been too quick to overlook. This realization underscored the importance of looking beyond surface-level indicators. The story a person's appearance might initially suggest is often far less complex and compelling than the lived experiences that have shaped them. Now consider how this might impact your interactions in a new environment, whether it's a different culture or even a different department at work. Seek out the stories etched into the hands that serve you, that build your world. The rhythm of the drive, the steady hum of the tires on the asphalt became a meditative backdrop to this internal unfolding. It was a gentle, almost imperceptible process, this shedding of ingrained judgment. There were no sudden epiphanies, no dramatic pronouncements of change, but rather a slow, steady accumulation of new understandings. The experience with Elias hadn't provided me with a neat set of rules or a philosophical treatise on morality. It had offered something far more potent, a visceral encounter with empathy, a direct experience of the consequences of my own narrow perspective. It was a lesson learned not through instruction, but through quiet observation and the undeniable impact of one human being's capacity for compassion on another. This wasn't about abstract principles. It was about the tangible, emotional reality of human connection and the profound responsibility that comes with recognizing it in every face we meet. The quiet hum of the tires on the asphalt had become a rhythm, a subtle counterpoint to the unfolding realization within me. It wasn't just about Mark's recovery, a tangible outcome that filled me with immense relief. It was about the subtle recalibration happening inside my own head, a shift in perspective that was less a sudden revelation and more a gradual unfolding, like a tightly furled bud slowly opening to the sun. The stark beauty of the borderlands, which had previously only amplified my anxiety and reinforced my preconceived notions, now seemed to hold a different kind of resonance. I started noticing the tenacious scrub brush, its roots digging deep into the arid soil, clinging to life with an almost defiant persistence. This visual metaphor for resilience, for an unwavering spirit in the face of seemingly insurmountable environmental challenges, began to resonate deeply with Elias's own quiet strength. His determination to not just survive, but to actively contribute, to heal, even in this unforgiving landscape, struck me as a profound act of living. This observation offered a crucial distinction. My own tendency to seek immediate validation, to expect a noticeable return for even small acts of kindness, felt shallow and self-centered when juxtaposed with Elias's steady, unassuming service. His actions weren't driven by a desire for recognition, but by an intrinsic understanding of need and a deep-seated commitment to alleviating suffering. Consequently, the very concept of need itself began to reframe itself in my mind. I had always approached need as a deficit, a void that demanded immediate rectification, often accompanied by an unspoken feeling of burden or obligation. Elias, conversely, seemed to perceive need not as a deficiency, but as an opening, a universal human condition that called for connection and empathy, rather than judgment or avoidance. He didn't view the families seeking aid at the clinic as mere problems to be solved or statistics to be managed. He saw them as individuals, each deserving of care and respect, their difficult circumstances serving only to underscore their fundamental human dignity. This perspective offered a significant departure from my own ingrained habit of categorizing and compartmentalizing people, of creating implicit hierarchies of worth, often based on superficial markers like perceived productivity or societal contribution. Now, consider how this might shift your own outlook when you encounter individuals whose life circumstances are vastly different from your own. Rather than focusing on the perceived gap or the external markers of their situation, try to actively recognize the shared human desire for respect, dignity, and care. Elias's approach suggested that the most impactful way to address need is not through clinical detachment or transactional assistance, but through genuine human connection, acknowledging the inherent worth in every person, regardless of their background or current struggles. Furthermore, the memory of Elias's hands, rough and calloused, began to shed its initial association with suspicion. Instead, I started to see them as powerful instruments of healing, hands that had likely toiled in fields, built homes, and most importantly, brought comfort and aid to the sick and injured. They were hands that spoke not of hardship in a way that invited pity, but of a life lived fully, of challenges met and overcome, and of a profound capacity for resilience that I had been far too quick to overlook. This realization underscored the critical importance of looking beyond immediate, surface-level indicators when forming impressions of others. The initial story a person's appearance might suggest is often far less complex, nuanced, and compelling than the lived experiences that have truly shaped them. Consequently, when you find yourself in a new environment, whether it's a different culture, a new neighborhood, or even a different department at work, actively seek out the unspoken stories etched into the hands that serve you, that build your world, that offer assistance. The rhythm of the drive, the steady hum of the tires on the asphalt, provided a meditative backdrop to this internal unfolding. It wasn't a process marked by dramatic epiphanies or sudden earth-shattering pronouncements of change. Instead, it was a slow, almost imperceptible accumulation of new understandings, a gradual rewiring of my own internal responses. The encounter with Elias hadn't equipped me with a neat set of moral guidelines or a philosophical treatise on the nature of ethics. Instead, it offered something far more potent and transformative, a visceral, deeply personal experience of empathy and a direct, undeniable confrontation with the consequences of my own narrow perspective. It was a lesson learned not through didactic instruction, but through quiet observation and the profound, undeniable impact of one human being's capacity for compassion on another. This was not about abstract principles or intellectual exercises. It was about the tangible, emotional reality of human connection and the significant responsibility that comes with actively recognizing and honoring that connection in every face we meet, in every interaction we have. The subtle shift in my perception wasn't just about Elias. It extended to the very environment we were navigating. The harshness of the borderlands, which I had initially perceived as inherently hostile, began to reveal a more complex tapestry of resilience and adaptation. It wasn't merely about survival. It was about the intricate ways life found purchase in seemingly barren soil, a quiet testament to tenacity. This observation offered a crucial layer to my understanding that what appears uniform and monolithic from a distance often reveals itself upon closer inspection to be a dynamic ecosystem of individual struggles and triumphs. Now consider how this applies when you encounter communities or situations that seem overwhelmingly challenging or foreign. Look for the individual threads of adaptation, the small victories that sustain life and spirit against all odds. Building on this, however, I recognize that my initial judgment of Elias was rooted in a failure to acknowledge the context of his existence. My understanding of need was framed by my own privileged experience, where needs were often met through established systems and predictable avenues. Elias, on the other hand, operated within a reality where such systems were non-existent or inaccessible. His act of healing, therefore, wasn't just an act of charity. It was an act of profound resourcefulness, a reclamation of agency in a space designed to strip it away. He wasn't merely filling a void. He was demonstrating a capacity to create order and offer solace where chaos and despair might otherwise reign supreme. Furthermore, the very notion of refugee transformed from a label of otherness into a descriptor of an arduous journey, a testament to a person's courage in the face of unimaginable loss. It wasn't an identity that defined Elias's limitations, but rather a chapter in a much larger, more complex life story. My prior mental categorization had flattened this complexity, reducing him to a single, often negative, attribute. This process of deconstruction allowed me to see him not as a recipient of aid, but as an active agent of healing, a skilled practitioner whose professional identity had been tragically disrupted but not extinguished. Another crucial layer to this evolving understanding was the realization that my own internal narrative had been remarkably self-centered. The inconveniences of the journey, the anxieties about my brother's health, the discomfort of being in an unfamiliar environment, these had occupied the forefront of my consciousness, overshadowing any genuine curiosity about the lives of those around me. Elias's calm demeanor and unwavering focus on Mark's well-being served as a stark contrast to my own internal turmoil. It highlighted the difference between reacting to circumstances with personal distress and responding to the needs of others with focused compassion. This wasn't about minimizing my own fears, but about recognizing that empathy requires a conscious redirection of attention, a willingness to momentarily set aside one's own concerns to truly see and engage with another's experience. Consequently, the simple act of observing Elias's interaction with Mark became a powerful lesson in non-verbal communication. The gentle touch on Mark's arm, the steady gaze, the unhurried movements, these gestures conveyed a depth of care that transcended language barriers. They spoke of a profound understanding of human vulnerability and a deep-seated respect for the suffering of another. Now consider how this applies when you're trying to connect with someone who speaks a different language or comes from a vastly different cultural background. Pay attention to the universal language of gesture, of posture, of the subtle cues that convey empathy and respect. often more effectively than words. This evolving perspective also brought into sharper focus the limitations of judging individuals based on perceived societal roles or economic status. Elias, stripped of his professional title and homeland, was still at his core a healer. His skills and his innate desire to alleviate suffering remained intact, irrespective of his current circumstances. My initial judgment had been based on a superficial assessment of his material possessions and social standing, failing to recognize the enduring qualities of character and competence that defined him far more profoundly. This challenged my own ingrained assumptions about success and value, suggesting that true worth lies not in external markers, but in the intrinsic qualities of compassion, skill, and resilience that an individual embodies. The subtle shift in my perception wasn't just about Elias, it extended to the very environment we were navigating. The harshness of the borderlands, which I had initially perceived as inherently hostile, began to reveal a more complex tapestry of resilience and adaptation. It wasn't merely about survival. It was about the intricate ways life found purchase in seemingly barren soil, a quiet testament to tenacity. This observation offered a crucial layer to my understanding that what appears uniform and monolithic from a distance often reveals itself upon closer inspection to be a dynamic ecosystem of individual struggles and triumphs. Now consider how this applies when you encounter communities or situations that seem overwhelmingly challenging or foreign. Look for the individual threads of adaptation, the small victories that sustain life and spirit against all odds. Building on this, however, I recognized that my initial judgment of Elias was rooted in a failure to acknowledge the context of his existence. My understanding of need was framed by my own privileged experience, where needs were often met through established systems and predictable avenues. Elias, on the other hand, operated within a reality where such systems were non-existent or inaccessible. His act of healing, therefore, wasn't just an act of charity, it was an act of profound resourcefulness, a reclamation of agency in a space designed to strip it away. He wasn't merely filling a void, he was demonstrating a capacity to create order and offer solace where chaos and despair might otherwise reign supreme. Furthermore, the very notion of refugee transformed from a label of otherness into a descriptor of an arduous journey, a testament to a person's courage in the face of unimaginable loss. It wasn't an identity that defined Elias's limitations, but rather a chapter in a much larger, more complex life story. My prior mental categorization had flattened this complexity, reducing him to a single, often negative attribute. This process of deconstruction allowed me to see him not as a recipient of aid, but as an active agent of healing, a skilled practitioner whose professional identity had been tragically disrupted but not extinguished. Another crucial layer to this evolving understanding was the realization that my own internal narrative had been remarkably self-centered. The inconveniences of the journey, the anxieties about my brother's health, the discomfort of being in an unfamiliar environment, these had occupied the forefront of my consciousness, overshadowing any genuine curiosity about the lives of those around me. Elias's calm demeanor and unwavering focus on Mark's well-being served as a stark contrast to my own internal turmoil. It highlighted the difference between reacting to circumstances with personal distress and responding to the needs of others with focused compassion. This wasn't about minimizing my own fears, but about recognizing that empathy requires a conscious redirection of attention, a willingness to momentarily set aside one's own concerns to truly see and engage with another's experience. Consequently, the simple act of observing Elias's interaction with Mark became a powerful lesson in non-verbal communication, the gentle touch on Mark's arm, the steady gaze, the unhurried movements. These gestures conveyed a depth of care that transcended language barriers. They spoke of a profound understanding of human vulnerability and a deep-seated respect for the suffering of another. Now consider how this applies when you are trying to connect with someone who speaks a different language or comes from a vastly different cultural background. Pay attention to the universal language of gesture, of posture, of the subtle cues that convey empathy and respect, often more effectively than words. The desert may have been left behind, but its vastness now resided within me, a space for quiet contemplation and the ongoing cultivation of a more open heart. The journey home was not an end, but a beginning, a gentle reminder that the most profound transformations often unfold not in moments of dramatic upheaval, but in the quiet aftermath, where the seeds of change once sown begin to quietly take root. Kindness, a borrowed light, found its way through